Welcome to The Last Unionist. I am your host, Toby Green, and we are going to be talking today about the Haymarket Square massacre or riot or whatever terminology that you would like to use. So we're going to just jump right on in. Now, a couple pieces of housekeeping before we jump right in. You can reach me at runtmg@gmail.com, and hopefully a website will be coming soon. We've got very humble beginnings of the Last Unionist podcast. So, Haymarket Square, and kind of show layout. So, getting to it, a couple very quick pieces to get out of the way. We are going to take our time getting to the Haymarket Square. We are not going to just boom right there, because it's a far more pivotal, far more fascinating story that continues to impact us today. So we are going to go through step by step, brick by brick in getting there. So in order to get us to that point, this is episode 1.01. And we are going to be talking about the teenager and the freedman. So, in thinking about this podcast, I wanted to bring together two completely disparate points and start talking about those points. So, those 2 points in particular are the experience of the immigrant coming over to America and the experience of the freedman slave. And the reason that these two stories are important to ultimately Haymarket is that they represent the two poles of the working class. So after the Civil War takes place, the working class is, generally speaking, pretty excited. The war is over. Their loved ones aren't getting murdered anymore. North and South are on some level happy about the peace. Of course, as we know, the South wasn't completely happy, but at least the bloodshed and the killing were done. But in those heady years after the negotiated peace, the question was this going to be a left-wing march of freedom, march of people having, everybody being able to live to be their best selves, or was this going to be a reestablishment or reconstruction of the old patterns of society? I'm not sure that any of that stuff ever got definitively answered, but during this time period, it was very clear that a reaction was going on. So in order to understand what would lead up to the Haymarket Square events, you've got to go back in time, and you've got to go back almost roughly 15 years previously, about 15 to 20 years previously, to get a good feel for what's leading up to this. Because it's not as though a bunch of people went marching for the 8-hour day and got shot and gunned down, and that caused a lot of problems. That is, to say that is what happened, or to look at that in that realm, means that you're dismissing, it would be equivalent to seeing lava but not understanding the explosion out of a volcano. So we're going to cover in this podcast both of those stories, so let's let our story begin. So let's start with the teenager first. So I want to take you to 1871, Hesse, Germany. And you've got a teenage boy, about 16 years old, 17 years old, give or take. And this boy had a great childhood. I mean, his father, first of all, he was born in an abandoned, converted castle. How cool is that? How many people can say that they were born in a frickin' castle? He was literally born in a castle, had been converted. His dad had a plush job. His dad was director or in the forestry department there in Germany, in Hesse, Germany. So, probably not the most controversial job on the face of the earth, and a pretty plush one. Probably not going to get too much into the weeds of something difficult. And during this time, his father the whole time was like, dude, you young man, you are going to follow in my steps because you've got made in the shade. You have got a job lined up for you. It's going to be awesome. But as we know, life has that terrible way of intervening on all the best laid plans. This 16-year-old would have his father die. His father would drop dead. And along with his father's death was all the dreams, all the things that he could have done. Now, if you're 16 years old in Germany with a family that was getting tossed into poverty, you likely had friends and loved ones who had gone over to America and had a better quality of life, or had a comparable quality of life, at the very least have an opportunity for a good quality of life. And this boy looked over to the States and said, "Wow, I'm not going to have a chance here. My dreams are kind of dashed. I'm going to go to America and make my way." Now, this kid had no idea that he would end up, over the next 20 years, reshaping America. And his work and the things that he does it. Now, this kid, this teenager we're talking about, he has a name. And his name is familiar to people. His name is August Spies. So August hops on a boat, and he says, "I'm taking off to America" in 1871. Now, we will come back to August, because his story, of course, if you've studied this situation, is central to the Haymarket Square massacre. But we can't just sit there and follow. This isn't just the August Spy story. This is a working class story. So we have to include, and understandably include, race. Because after the American Revolution happened, not American Revolution, the Civil War, pardon me. After the Civil War takes place, we have something very incredible that happens. Because keep in mind, Lincoln at this point is about as close to a left-wing folk hero as you could get in America. Lincoln had passed the Emancipation Proclamation. He was looked at as a moderate. He was looked at as somebody who was trying to keep the Union together, couldn't do it. Was picking up slaves who no longer wanted to be in slavery. They had a chance to throw this yoke off. And it was during this time that something really incredible happens. Sherman's March to the Sea takes place in the early 1864. Now, what does that have to do with America's, with what we're talking about? This march to the sea that Sherman did, this march to the sea that Sherman did, had a very interesting impact. And it's something that history books don't talk about much. Because as Sherman is going to the sea and making Atlanta howl and, really, really bringing the South underfoot and really making it clear that this war was done, what was happening was all these freed African American, I'm going to use the term black for just purpose to be very clear, these free black slaves that were suddenly free were following. Because after all the infrastructure is getting burned. These folks were hungry. Now the structure has been upset. The apple cart is done. And it is in that point that we get to something very, very interesting takes place. Because prior to any formal governmental policy on Reconstruction, Sherman created his own land redistribution policy. He met with Edwin Stanton, who was Lincoln's Secretary of War, and a delegation of about 20 black leaders. And they were trying to address this in January of 1865. And basically these new freedmen said, "Hey, look, we just want our own land. Look, we're not going to bother. We're not going to go out and seek retribution against the slave owners. Just give us our own land." So Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15. And this order declared that the sea islands on the coast of South Carolina and Georgia would be reserved for the freedmen. And under this order, each family would be eligible for up to 40 acres of land for their own cultivation. This area included islands of Hilton Head, Port Royal, St. Helena, and many other smaller islands that had been under Union control since 1861. Sherman would go on to allow freedmen use of army mules that were no longer fit for army service. These acts would serve as the basis for the cry of 40 acres and a mule. And this basis was amazing for freedmen's hopes and demands later in Reconstruction. So Sherman was moved because of the starvation. I mean, he had a real problem. Yes, he had brought Atlanta to kneel, but the folks who had been freed were like, "You got to do something." And almost 40,000 freedmen had settled in the Sea Islands, working over 400,000 acres of land. The farmer slaves believed that this was their land, now theirs to keep. Congress had established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the Freedmen's Bureau, shortly after Sherman's order was issued. The Bureau had the authority to give 40 acres of plots of abandoned and confiscated land to the freedmen and Southern white refugees who had been loyal to the Union. In addition, the man in charge of the Sea Islands as inspector of settlements and plantations, General Rufus Saxon, was a supporter of the freedmen, and he worked to make the program successful. So this was like a big dream. They now had land. But here's the deal. After Lincoln died especially, the policy of land redistribution never had the full support in Congress. And some argued for a hands-off approach to the freedmen, which they claimed would foster independence, while others insisted it would be unfair to abandon freedmen to their former masters without economic base. So basically, the freedmen had won something, but then they had lost something. What would happen was that President Andrew Johnson, after Lincoln got killed, began the assault on the Sea Islands experiment in January 1866 when he removed General Saxon from office and pardoned many former rebels. So this was, by the way, part of Lincoln's own plan. This wasn't necessarily just Johnson. This was Johnson acting out what was going to happen to Lincoln, what Lincoln likely would have done. He basically walked back on all the promises that he had made. Unfortunately for the world, Lincoln gets killed, so we don't know if Lincoln actually would have done this. But the freedmen and women were urged to go to work as paid laborers for their former masters. So this hope and dream crashes down on the freedmen's heads. Now, years later, there were lawsuits and all that other stuff, but I'm not going to work or worry about that so much, because at the end of the day, this was important land. This was an important concession that was won and was ripped back as soon as the reactionaries to this thing, to the Reconstruction, the more liberal Reconstruction efforts took place. And in that place is where our story really comes to fruition. Because this creates a dynamic that you see in the working class time and time again. This is what capitalism does in many ways, and this is where the racism, sexism, and homophobia that are in the system is inherent. Suddenly these freed men who had suffered under slavery, who had been supported by the North, had a promise given to them, and much like the Native Americans, our folks before, was ripped away as soon as it was convenient to do so, and ripped out from underneath them. And by doing that piece, by taking that piece and ripping that piece away, it shows what can happen. It shows that the United States also is not afraid of breaking a promise or a vow or any type of deal, or amending the deal later. So in our thoughts, as we talk about August spies coming to America and the freedmen, we're not going to spend too much time on the freedmen as we go forward, but I wanted to bring that up as part of understand the cry and the hue over the 8-hour workday. Is that, simply put, these type of actions, and you'll see this over and over again, show that when it suits the economy's needs, when it suits the owners of society's needs, they will rewrite a deal and take a deal back. And they do this oftentimes to restrict things and to set people against each other, because if workers are united, they cannot be defeated. When workers are divided, they're very easy. I consider the freed men who were freed in this struggle to be every bit as part of the Haymarket Square Revolution. They were just excised out, the Haymarket Square Massacre. They were just excised out right from the jump. So when we go into next week, when we go into the next episode next week, we're going to talk about as this is going on with the freedmen in the 1860s, early 1870s, as this issue is playing out, and as August Spies is boarding a boat to come to America, labor is recognizing that the Gilded Age is not presenting them with a whole lot of hopes. And in response, they're going to form an organization called the Knights of Labor. And we are going to talk next week about the founding of the Knights of Labor as a means to respond to the increasing power disparity that was going on in America.